some ideas off of you. I am editing a book about these 6 women here, Ohio's first ladies. Those 6 women who became first ladies who were born in Ohio. So technically, there were 8 first ladies that had Ohio connections. But 2 of them, they were only very vague connections. One is the first Mrs. Harrison, William Henry Harrison's wife, Anna. And of course, he was only president for a month and she never really took on the job. And she was born in Virginia. And then Julia Grant is sometimes considered an Ohio First Lady because her husband was born in Ohio and had Ohio connections, but she was born and grew up in Missouri and really has no real Ohio presence. So this book, Ohio's First Ladies from the Midwest to the White House, is going to deal with the 6 Ohio-born First Ladies. And I was asked to do this in celebration of the 250th anniversary of the United States being established next year by the University of Cincinnati Press that has had a series specifically on the 250th anniversary of the birth of the U.S. and Ohio's connection to that event. Subsequently, the trustees at the University of Cincinnati have closed down the press, and that series is now going to the press here at my university, Ohio University Press, which is even better because for years I was the chair of the faculty advisory board for OU Press, and I know those folks very well, and I know they'll do a great job. But it was only last semester that I learned that this book has a new home, and it will be with Ohio University Press. And I only this weekend just finished editing the 6th chapter for this collection and have yet to even begin writing the introduction to this collection. But some of the ideas I have in terms of the commonalities among these 6 women I'm about to introduce you to, and introduce you to physical sites, as well as the women themselves, physical sites where the women resided or had an impact. It has taken a little bit of imagination to think about what are the connections among these 6 women and what makes them particularly Midwestern. And so what I have discovered so far reading through the 6 individual chapters, all 6 of these women had a very straightforward communication style, which I think is a characteristic of the Midwest. You know, it's not, it can be polite communication, but it's not going to be a communication style that's a lot of, well, here are the preliminaries, and a half hour into the conversation, I get to the point. All 6 of these women were very straightforward communicators. They were all very practical minded, which is, I would argue, a Midwestern trait. They all had a strong work ethic. Also, a characteristic oftentimes associated with the Midwest. It probably goes without saying they were all elite white women. They have that in common. But two aspects of the personalities or experiences of all 6 women, I think, are what I really want to emphasize in my introduction to this collection, which is they were all incredibly well-educated women for women born in the 19th century. And many of them were even college educated. And I think back to the University Gate here at Ohio University that Jordan has seen in person many times. Deb has seen it in person at least once, that has the language of the Northwest Ordinance. and the creation of what becomes the Midwest out of the Northwest Territory. One element of that establishing language was the importance of education. And that is something that in the biographies of all six of these women is such a central factor. Whether it is a formal education, in, for instance, high school or college setting, or education through private lessons. And they were all very well educated women. And then another factor that had an impact on all six lives and their identities was the Civil War. And for four of the six women, they are either young adults or children during the war, and we can see why the war would be a very central experience to their lives. Ohio had a major presence in the Civil War in terms of troop numbers and people who served in civilian capacities in the Civil War, men and women. And of course, we bordered at that time two states that practiced slavery, even though the Northwest Ordinance had always forbidden slavery here in Ohio. But the fact that a river separates Kentucky from Ohio, and before the creation of West Virginia during the Civil War, we also bordered Virginia. So two slaveholding states, and we are a Union state, a northern state, but just next door to slavery. And so even the last two of these women, Mrs. Taft and Mrs. Harding, who were born during the Civil War, and so would not have memories of it. The Civil War and what it had meant to Ohioans for generations to come, I think still affected their lives very much. So I think those are two aspects I really want to play up in the introduction: the importance of education to Ohioans and the importance of the Civil War to Ohioans, and this is reflected in all their life stories. So I will introduce you to these folks. This is Lucy Webb Hayes, and I know for certain that these are the two illustrations that will be part of that chapter about Lucy Webb Hayes. OU Press is allowing only two illustrations per chapter. And this was the chapter I was editing this weekend, the last one to come in, but chronologically the first of our Ohio born First Ladies, Lucy Webb Hayes. And the picture at the left is her wedding picture with Rutherford B. Hayes. And the one on the right is her official White House portrait. So these will be the two illustrations for that chapter. So she was born in Chillicothe, Ohio in 1831, and she dies in Fremont, Ohio in 1889. And she is our first college-educated First Lady. She went to a Methodist college in Cincinnati. And she's the first First Lady to be called by that title on a regular basis, First Lady. She also invented the Easter egg roll. But she's probably known mainly for never serving alcohol in the White House. And so she had this derisive nickname that developed after she left the White House, which was Lemonade Lucy. But both she and her husband, Rutherford B. Hayes, were temperance advocates. And although she's the person who's credited with having a dry White House, his word was final, and he said, we won't have alcohol. So they, at receptions, would serve lemonade, but with crushed raspberries in it, which made it look sort of like wine, or red wine anyway. And it is her White House portrait that was commissioned by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They paid for this portrait with donations. So she was seen as very important and dear to the WCTU and to its pro-suffrage, women's suffrage campaign. But once she's in the White House, even though she had been an abolitionist, she had been a women's rights advocate, she was definitely a proponent of temperance and a big advocate of women's formal education. She didn't play up any of those aspects of her life before coming to the White House and her political beliefs while she was in the White House. But nevertheless, people, especially in the temperance movement, knew that she was a temperance advocate. She was disappointed in that not all of the money that the WCTU raised went into this portrait, but instead, although the campaign was to raise money to make her White House portrait, some of the money that was raised went to other WCTU projects at a time when she was really um, trying not to emphasize her temperance leanings, particularly before being First Lady. She had been the U.S. She was First Lady of Ohio that had a big German American population who didn't like the temperance movement. So these were her beliefs. She didn't try to hide them, but she also didn't play them up. But she was angry with the WCTU that they said they were raising all this money for her portrait, but instead ended up using some of the money they raised for other projects. But I want to show you pictures of a couple of historic sites that are associated with Lucy Webb Hayes. This is her birthplace in Chillicothe. And so this is someplace I've actually visited. We have a branch campus of Ohio University that's located in Chillicothe. And actually, one time I had organized what I called what did I call that? History on the Road. It's when I was chair of the history department here at OU. And I had a series of events that I was organizing called History on the Road. And they were seminars in different locations around this southeastern Ohio. And one was a seminar on the history of First Ladies. So it seemed appropriate that we would meet in Chillicothe, the birthplace of Lucy Webb Hayes. And so this is her birthplace. I didn't take this picture, but this is definitely what I saw on that occasion, and it is run by the Ross County Historical Society. And it's sort of a standard middle class southeastern Ohio home of the era, nothing fancy, but they were definitely people who didn't have financial problems. The picture on the right is the Hayes's home estate, I guess we would call it, in Fremont, Ohio. And it is run by what used to be called the Ohio Historical Society. It's now called the Ohio History Connection. And I visited there the fall before last, and I did take this particular picture. This is on the driveway up to the Hayes home. And there's also a presidential library and museum there. And it's also where Lucy Webb Hayes and Rutherford B. Hayes are buried. So since this is a group, Rick, that's interested in historical sites, I thought I would share these two sites that are associated very much with Lucy Webb Hayes. And really, the setup there in Fremont is very nice. It's very well interpreted, and she, of course, she is very much at the center of the story here at the birthplace in Chillicothe, but also here at the Hayes home in Fremont, Ohio. She's as much interpreted here in her life and her experiences as is her husband's. So she was definitely a political partner with him throughout his career, and a pretty impressive woman. The next First Lady born in Ohio is Lucretia Rudolph Garfield. The picture on the left is Lucretia. Her nickname was Crete. Crete Garfield and James Garfield at the time of their engagement, which would have been 1858, around there. And he seems to be wearing his Phi Beta Kappa key there. They were both college educated. And then this is a photograph of her in 1881, the only year she lived in the White House, because as you may recall, Her husband was assassinated only a few months into his time as president. She was born in a place called Garrettville, Ohio in 1832, which is in northeastern Ohio. And she died in Pasadena, California in 1918. She was uh, mainly known for her time as First Lady as being someone sort of an earlier Jackie Kennedy character, in that the way that she conducted herself, not only after her husband's death and her communication with the American people, we've lost our leader, but we will continue forward as a nation. Remember, it was months that he was incapacitated and was being cared for after he was shot before he died. So during this time in which has this lingering death, she's also a stabilizing force and a role model to Americans. How do we conduct ourselves at this time of tragedy? And the two places that I chose to show you in these slides today that are associated with Lucretia or Crete Garfield are the Mentor, Ohio site here on the left. And yes, I took this picture myself, which is a National Historic Site. And so it's a park run by the Park Service. And this was their house, but there's also a library and museum here in Mentor, Ohio. And here on the right is a place I haven't visited, which is her home in retirement, and the home where she died in 1918 in Pasadena, California. And this is a postcard of it in the 1910s. I hope it's still standing after the fires in Southern California. It's a green and green house. Many of you probably would recognize those architectural features of a green and green design. And so for a long time, this was sort of her winter home. And then finally, in her last year, she lived there permanently. She, in her widowhood, did something very important. She is actually, Lucretia Garfield is the person who is credited with coming up with the idea of presidential libraries. And she established the first one here in Mentor, Ohio. She built a special wing onto this house to house her husband's large collection of documents and books. And it became the model for later the presidential libraries of the 20th century, first established by the Roosevelts at Hyde Park, that became part of the National Archives, of course, the National Archives system. So many historians credit her with coming up with this idea that after a president has been in office, his papers should be systematically collected, curated, organized, preserved. So you can see all of that here at the site in Mentor, and I toured there the same weekend that I toured the Hayes site. So this would be fall 2023. I took the picture on the left. Our next Ohio-born First Lady is Caroline Scott Harrison. I don't have a picture of her in her youth with her husband. I have this picture of her alone, and then this is her White House portrait on the right. Caroline Scott was born in Oxford, Ohio, which is the home of Ohio University's chief rival, Miami University. So Ohio University was the first university in the old Northwest Territory and in Ohio, and Miami University was the second. And she was born in Oxford, Ohio in 1832, and she died while she was still First Lady in Washington, D.C. in 1892. And she was a very skilled artist. And she had some grand plans for the White House. She wanted to add 2 additional wings, and she had drawn up plans, again, a precursor to a 20th century First Lady, same First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, in that she really worked to bring more historic objects and pieces of furnishing into the White House and worked to improve it and restore portions of the White House that were in disrepair. And she wanted to add additional wings to the White House. And she started the White House China Room, actually. So she was interested in what today we would call historical preservation, but she was also a skilled artist. And one of her specialties, which was a very popular leisure activity for elite white women at this time, was China painting. But she had a lot of formal training as an artist, and she even had cabinet members' wives and daughters and some of her friends, when she was First Lady, come and learn from a European trained artist about how to do China painting. And some of the works that you can now see today, there at the right at the Harrison home in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is part of the it is a National Historic Landmark. So is part of the Parks Service. I've never been there personally, and she and her husband are very much affiliated with Benjamin Harrison and Caroline Harrison. She went by the nickname Carrie, are very much associated, as I said, with Miami, Ohio, the university, and the Miami University, excuse me, and the town of Oxford, Ohio, where Miami's located. But eventually he decided to take his law practice to Indianapolis. And if I were to visit the house, and they custom built this, and she was very involved in the design of their home there in Indianapolis. If I were to visit there, I'd like to visit in spring and take a picture like this, although I did not take this picture. Looks like the kind of thing I would do, frame a picture of a historic house, with the spring flowering trees. But she is still very much tied in Ohio history to the town of Oxford. And this is a sculpture of her outside the Women's College there in Oxford, Ohio, that eventually will merge with Miami University. So this is a life-size statue of her. I've never seen it in person. Next time, now that I know, see, I had to edit this book to learn about all these first ladies and their sites. So now I know it's there. I'll go visit it. It's actually outside now the Oxford, Ohio Community Center. But what had been on that location was a building for the Women's College there. And she too is a college graduate. So we have, again, this emphasis on education among all of these Ohio-born First Ladies. She dies while she is First Lady, and her funeral is back here in Indianapolis. But as the body was being taken to Indianapolis by train, there was a ceremony here in Oxford as well. And there is a building there at Miami University now that's named for Caroline Harrison. And also the chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution there in Oxford is named for her. And the very first Daughters of the American Revolution chapter in Indiana is named for her. And she was the first, of course, I don't know much about the Daughters of the American Revolution other than they were a segregationist organization at the time when Eleanor Roosevelt was First Lady. That very famous story, how she resigns from the Daughters of the American Revolution because they wouldn't let Marian Anderson, the Black contralto, sing at Constitution Hall. But since then, and I looked at their mission statement, they are an inclusive organization. Front page of their website play up that if you have any connection, your ancestors, to the American Revolution, regardless of race, creed, etc., you can qualify. But anyway, I think the title is something like, you know, Grand General or something. The head honcho person of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is largely a symbolic role. She was the first person to hold it as First Lady when the Daughters of the American Revolution is established in the 1890s, when she is still First Lady. So she's very strongly associated with that organization. Happy to report it is now a very inclusive organization, apparently. Ida Saxton McKinley was born in Canton, Ohio, and in 1847, and she died in Canton, Ohio in 1907. And this is a picture of her here on the left with her husband, William McKinley, early in their marriage. And then here on the right, this is a couple of years before he's elected president in 1896 for the first time. This is 1894, with one of his major patrons, Mark Hanna, the man who's at the head of the table there at the left. But I thought a dinner table picture of the two of them together, Ida McKinley and William McKinley, was appropriate because even when they were in the White House, they always sat together at the dinner table rather than each of them at the head of the table, which was customary for the president and first lady in the White House, because she suffered from epilepsy. We now know. At the time, they didn't give a name to these seizures that she would have. And he liked to sit next to her because when she would have a seizure, he would take a napkin and cover her face. And everyone just went along with that. Oh, that's fine. I think we would see that as unusual behavior today, but this is how they dealt with it in the McKinley White House. She'd had a lot of personal tragedy. Both their children had died before coming to the White House. And she had, with that second, the birth of her second daughter had done a lot of physical damage to her. She was a very small woman. If you've seen her gown there at the Smithsonian, she has to be our most petite first lady. She was tiny and didn't get appropriate medical treatment. And this started a decline in her health. And so the whole time she was there in the White House as First Lady, she was in medical distress, but that didn't daunt her. She was in a wheelchair most of the time, and she would have these seizures. And as I said, not only her husband, but other people who sat near her at the dinner table. Well, when she has a seizure, just put the napkin over her head till it passes. So they always sat together, and here they are at Mark Hanna's house doing the same thing. So he would take, if she would have had a seizure at this dinner table setting here at Mark Hanna's house, William McKinley would have just taken the napkin and draped it over her face. But she would always welcome people to the White House, the governor's mansion, and this house that they lived in Canton, Ohio. And this is one of those famous Katherine Jellison original photographs that I took on a dreary November day a few years ago. Their house there in Canton was the house she grew up in, Ida McKinley grew up in, and then it became their house together as a young couple. And now it is the First Lady's National Historic Site and National First Ladies Library. So this research facility about the history of First Ladies is located in Ida McKinley's family home that became the home of the McKinleys together. But it was originally the Saxton home. It was added on to later and expanded. And so I was there to do a talk several years ago on a dreary November day, and I took this picture. So in this house at the governor's mansion in Columbus, and then later in the White House, she would greet visitors in her wheelchair and say hello to them and chat with them before visitors went on to visit her husband on those days when she was feeling up to it. And her thing that she liked to do was crochet and knit little slippers for people. And so usually when she would have these conversations with visitors, she'd say, oh, are there any new babies in the family? Do you have a sick relative who needs some house slippers? And so there are still vast collections of these slippers that she made. Of course, her husband was also assassinated. And when she comes back to Canton, Ohio, after her husband's death, then this is the house she lived in. but she dies 6 years after her husband in 1907. So this is really she was born in Canton, she died in Canton, and this was the house she grew up in and the house she lived her young married years in. As I said, it's now the First Lady's National Historic Site and National First Ladies Library. So it's the only site we really associate with Ida McKinley is this house, now Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio. Helen Herron Taft, who went by the nickname Nellie, was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, the first year of the Civil War, 1861, and she dies in Washington, D.C. in 1943. Here she is. I don't have any pictures of her with William Howard Taft as a young couple, but here she is as a young woman, and here's her official White House portrait, which is one of the most impressive portraits, I think. This is the Taft home in Cincinnati. It's a National Historic Site. I've never visited there. I've been to Cincinnati many times, but now that I've learned more about it, editing this book, I will definitely visit there. And this was the home that they built as a young married couple in Cincinnati. Her husband was, of course, an attorney. And then during the years that she's First Lady, she is the person that we associate with the cherry trees in Washington, D.C. And supposedly this sculpture of a Japanese lantern, and those of you who, such as Heather, who know D.C. like the back of their hands, will tell me if this is accurate. Supposedly this sculpture is at the site where Nellie Taft and a woman representing the Japanese government planted the first cherry trees during the Taft years in the White House.
That's my understanding. I will add that because of the seawall around the tidal basin is in complete disrepair, all those trees are being or will be cut down so they can rebuild and they will replant more trees. So,
and that was one of the questions I had, if any of her original trees will survive. I've read a lot about this replanting effort, but anyway, these are the two sites mainly associated with Nellie Taft, her home in Cincinnati as a married woman, and the tidal basin cherry trees. And then, of course, her husband, after his presidency, will be appointed to the Supreme Court, and they move back to DC. And that's where she's living then when she dies in 1943. And then finally, this woman, Florence Kling Harding, was born in Marion, Ohio, the year before the Civil War, 1860, and she dies in Marion, Ohio in 1924. Well, you probably know a lot about her in that she was a divorced woman when she married her husband, Warren G. Harding. And she was 5 years older than him, and was from a much more prominent family, the Kling family. Her father had gotten wealthy in the hardware business, and she was seen as someone who was very instrumental to building her husband's political career and her family money, helping along his political career. But he was not faithful to her. And as we now know through DNA testing, had a child with one of his mistresses. They never had children together. She had a child with her first husband, her youthful marriage at about age 20. And in fact, she was pregnant, and it was an elopement. So she kind of downplayed her wild youth. And by the time she's a senator's wife and then First Lady there in DC, she is very much seen as politically savvy as a well-connected Washington hostess and is seen as pretty popular first lady. Here's, again, I don't have a picture of her at a young age with her husband, the future president, but here she is as a young woman. And then this is her official White House portrait. And a million times or so, it seems I've been to this house. And to prove to you I was actually there I am, the Harding House in Marion, Ohio, which is also run by the Ohio History Connection. It's not a national historic site, but it is managed by the Ohio History Connection. And so at least 3 times I've been there. The last time was when I was doing my presidential weekend tour with another historian there, who is a presidential historian, Dean Kotlowski. So you can see it is the fall of 2023. We have the fall foliage there. This is a house that Florence and Warren Harding built together. It is where he had his famous 1920 front porch campaign. So that's where Professor Kotlowski and I are posing on the front porch where that campaign took place. And because her husband dies in office in 1923, and she dies the following year after having just moved back to Marion, Ohio from the White House in 1924, she dies. It is a house that has more of the original objects, furniture, even Harding family clothing, her son from her first marriage, his toys, because when she dies, everything's still there. And she's already left in her will this house to the state of Ohio. So it is a very, I didn't take this picture. Obviously, I didn't take the one on the right either. The tour guide, the interpreter, took this picture of Professor Kotlowski and me. But it is almost as if Florence just left the place. And it is another site that I think does a good job of not only telling us Warren Harding's story, but Florence Harding's story. And there is a new facility there that is a presidential library and museum that I hadn't toured before until this fall of 2023 when this picture was taken. And it's a nice facility too. So of the places I've actually been to, the Hayes site, the Garfield site, the Harding site, I think all these places do a good job of reflecting the woman who lived at those houses as well as the man who lived at those houses. And certainly the Saxton McKinley house that's now the First Lady's National Historic Site and National First Ladies Library, very much. Ida McKinley is a presence in how, if you go to tour that facility, how that house is interpreted. So I'm happy to answer any questions or get any feedback. And there you have it. That's my